Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lei, the CVA, the Community Volunteer Ambassador for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. I'm here reporting live this time in Yosemite National Park, which is pretty exciting. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and read our general consent statement. So, as a visible disclosure, we'd like to inform any participants that any and all Zoom series is and will be recorded. The purpose of this is to provide the Zoom series to those who participated or missed out on the session. It is also provided the information for participants to refer back to. In addition to the visible disclosure, the statement will be orally stated at the beginning of each Zoom series like I am right now. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off to Riza to introduce our guest speaker today.
All right, thanks, Lei. And yeah, so everybody working at SATWIWA and coordinating a lot of the Indigenous programs we have there, I've had the pleasure to meet many people from different Indigenous backgrounds, and Tina and her husband and daughter are one of them, and they've been great supporters. So it's really great she was able to make some time to answer questions that everybody has. It was, we had a hard time trying to, decide like what topics should we cover, because most of everybody, could grab a book and read it or search the web. So those of you who gave me questions to hand off to Tina, and she created these presentations. So the next one will be next month. She did mention to me before this Zoom session, if after this presentation or during this presentation, there's more questions that pop up, you could email them to me and we could probably integrate them for her next presentation next month. So without further ado, Tina Calderon, welcome and thank you for hosting this presentation for us.
Mi hija nehink netonya netina, haku kichichanti gakti tina. So I'm greeting you in both of my languages, which is both Tongva and Chumash. So to give you a little bit of background, yes, my name is Tina Orduno Calderon. My ancestral village is in the Santa Monica Mountains. It is the village of Comicragna, and it is the eastmost village of that mountain range. And it is actually a Tongva village. But as you know, we intermarried, so we had Chumash people living in our village. And likewise, throughout the Chumash villages in that mountain range, we also had some Tongva people living in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and share screen to get started and share the presentation. Okay. And let me put this bigger. All right. So I put this in Chumash because the majority of people who lived in that mountain range were Chumash. So I chose the name Axtawasin, which means to be clear or understandable. And what I wanted to share with y'all, because I know all of you are quite knowledgeable, you work in the area, you volunteer in the area, you live in the area, so you probably have read tons of stuff. But a lot of times the stuff that is put out there is done by anthropologists, and sometimes things from way back in the past are quoted. And so there's not a lot of clarity in the information because sometimes it's things that have changed. At least the understanding of things have changed. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next screen. And I want to thank you all, first of all, for all of that you do. And I know as volunteers, you take a lot of pride in taking care of the lands, and that is huge to us. So thank you so much. I think your questions were all amazing. It was so difficult to decide what to put in the first half and what to put in the second half, but they will all be covered. So please do come back on the second part. And then in some cases, there was questions that were very similar, or they were different, but they complemented each other. So I kind of put those together so that I could give you a bigger overview. So it might answer a little bit more than even what you were asking. So I'll go to the next one. Let's get started. So the first questions, this was two, was how we use native foods and plants, and how we use plants for tools, medicines, and practices. So some plants we used for food. definitely. Acorn, chia, pine nuts, berries, cactus, yucca flowers, roots, that type of thing would be for foods. We also made lots of teas with the herbs and good medicines. And these teas could be used just to enjoy, or they could be used medicinally. So some of the more common things we used were the different sage plants, elderberry, mugwort, wild rose, that kind of thing. Some plants we used for dyes and inks. And those would be things like purple nightshade, black walnut, sumac, and berries. And then we had other plants that we use for baskets, seed beaters, which is a tool, for our, arrows and different things like that, our baskets. So those would be things like juncus, tule, yucca, pine needles, and willow. And this is just a sampling. I mean, there's so many others. And then I'm sure that you'll all read that we were like hunter-gatherers and seafarers. And I say that's partly true. We did hunt, we did fish, we did gather, and we didn't plant crops like the people to the south. But we did work with our environment. We treated the plants as relatives, and we never took too much. We always wanted to make sure that we, took what we needed, but never too much from any one plant or one area. So we didn't over harvest. We wanted to make sure that there was enough plants that would go into seed for the following year, so we would have abundance. And then there was proper times to harvest. So I give an example because sage is something that looks beautiful year round. And technically you could pull year round, but we didn't. We harvested in the spring before it went to seed. And so this helped the plant to stay strong, because if you were pulling while it's seeding, you're stressing the plant. And we wanted, again, to make sure that there was ample enough for the next year. So harvesting time was very important. Cutting the leaves in a way that would encourage new growth, never pulling out from the root, for example. And lastly, the way that we approach the use of these foods and medicines was in a reciprocal way. Before we would take, we asked permission, and we would give a gift of food or water, basically, and also sometimes tobacco or some medicine that was important to us, because we would be laying down prayers. And one thing with these plants is sometimes they have great medicinal uses, but they have a variety of medicinal uses. So we believed that by telling the plant our intentions, why we were needing it, what we were going to take it for, maybe to heal a child, we were communicating with that plant and helping the plant to help us by giving that kind of medicine for what we needed. So always we took things in a reciprocal way, never taking without giving. And I added, even though that they asked only about plants, is that hunting was also approached in this way, because we knew that we were taking a life, and that was not taken lightly. So there would be ceremony and prayer beforehand, and there would be ceremony and prayer afterwards. And I'll go into that a little bit deeper in another part of this presentation. But the other thing was that when we did take an animal, or plant for that matter, we had so much respect for it and what it was giving to us that we never wasted any of it. Every part was used. And by the way, if you do have questions about what I'm presenting today, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll review that at the end. So the next question we got was, which birds were part of spirit lore? So my answer was that all birds and animals, for that matter, are our relatives. That's how we looked at them. We didn't ever look at them as beneath us. And they all held a special significance for certain people or certain clans. So it's kind of hard to answer just one thing, because what was important to these people might be different for these people over here. But there are certain ones that were very commonly thought throughout, that they were very special animals. They were messengers. And so they're asking about birds. So I'm going to go into that. Hummingbirds, for instance. All of these are considered messenger birds. So they were cherished for their beauty and their strength. And so when we see those birds, it's a blessing. We have songs for them. The northern flicker that brought us balance and good luck. Hawk and eagle, they carried our prayers, and so they were messengers of blessings. The owl, we love him, but we don't want to see him too often because he was the messenger of death. So some people do fear the owl. Raven held spiritual and mystical powers. Condor was looked to for superior strength and empowerment. So these are some of the main birds that everybody held very sacred. And then I also added some other animals, which were also part of our family. Like literally, they're all family, but like close ties. I mean, it's like saying your mom and your dad and your cousin and your, you know, people that are in your close network. So the dolphin, the swordfish, the whale, the coyote, the fox, the wildcat, and the deer. These were all special animals, and I know that they were because we still have that relation today, and they're in our stories and our songs. Okay, the next question I got was the role and contributions historically of the Chumash women. So our women were respected as matriarchs and life givers, and the elderly women were consulted in council for critical decisions. And though most of our tribal leaders were men, a woman could hold that position if she chose to and if she earned that position. Certainly our women were healers and medicine women, and they were the basket makers, which was also very highly prized because that was a difficult skill to master. And we used baskets for cooking, we used it for storage. It was played such a big part of our daily traditions. So I hope that answers enough. And then I'll go, a little bits of these pieces will kind of come up in the rest of the presentation as well. So this next question, boy, it really sat heavy with me. The question, I actually condensed it a little bit and left out a little bit, but I'll explain why. The question was there a Chumash practice of eliminating bad kids in ceremony? Were they purposely overdosed with datura? Were the kids, I can't even see all the words because I see you all on this corner. But basically, were they only the good kids allowed to grow into adulthood, and were the children marked at this time? So this is something that I understand is very not understood by a lot of people. It's a deep subject, but basically it was common practice for our youth to have a coming of age ceremony at puberty. There was a girl's ceremony, there was a boy's ceremony. This was not a punishment, this was not something bad, this was a rite of passage. And at this time, we would take our children and we saw what kind of qualities they had, what they were interested in, what they were strongest in. And this was the time that we prepared them for adulthood and what they would do, being contributing parts of our tribe. So these ceremonies were led by spiritual leaders. It would last a minimum of 4 days. The children were prepared for their duties. So in other words, they were counseled and it was a special time. During these 4 days, it wasn't just one person, you know, one ceremonial leader. This would be multiple people working with these children. And so that there was different advisors that would step in for the training. If this person was going to be a medicine person, then they would bring in a medicine person to advise them. If they were going to be a seer, if they had that ability, they were going to bring somebody in, to lead that person and guide them and give them that knowledge. So this was a very important training period. And endurance and strength was part of it. Like literally they would have these races, and the datura was administered, but it was administered very carefully. It was never done to eliminate bad kids or anybody else. It's a sacred medicine. And it was not something that was just taken at any time. There was ceremonial leaders that had to give it, and they knew what dosages to give it to them in. Now, were any children ever didn't make it by taking that? Yes, that did happen, but it wasn't huge numbers. And when that happened, it was looked at as that that youth was not strong enough to handle this journey, and they crossed over. So, you know, of course, it's not taken lightly. There would be a memorial service, and because part of this question that I received said like the parents just sat there and watched. And so no, the parents were part of this ceremony, but they weren't there the whole time. And if that happened, of course, something different then would transpire because they would have to have a memorial, which was done at a separate time. But I just wanted to let you know that no, we never eliminated bad kids. We would mentor them. We would put them in the right hands of people that could help them. And it was all about teaching. So the part about marking though, we did do tattoos. That was common practice. And our girls at that time would receive what we call a moch. It's a chin tattoo. And that moch is, it's being revived today. So you're gonna start seeing more and more women wearing it. It started the revival up in Northern California, as well as other cultures. The whole, what is it called, the Rim of Fire? All of these nations did this tattoo. They're different. Some have them up here. For the Chumash and the Tongva, we did it on the chin, mostly. They also had some here across. But at this time would be when the girls received their chin tattoo or their moch. And oftentimes what they got, it's kind of, the most common is 3 lines, one in the center, 2 on the sides. So a lot of people call it the 111. But sometimes they were a little bit different. And again, it would depend, what you got was what you were going to be in life, what traits that you showed that you had the strengths in. They would, that marking that you got would kind of show that. So if I was a medicine person, you would know by seeing my marking. Also, if you were the daughter of a chief, you would have the family marking. So this is something that is not taken lightly even today. We have ceremony that we do, and we prepare the women. We have songs that we sing. So I just wanted to really dive into this question, because these are the kind of information that you'll hear, whether it be in books or by presenters. If they don't fully understand the culture, they're going to present what they understand of it. So I just wanted, that's why I named this presentation Clarity, because I really want you to understand that although we'll read certain things, sometimes people don't understand the whole context of what they're reading. So I'm going to go to the next screen. And the question was about spirituality, sacred beliefs, practices, religion, our relationship to the land and vice versa, and how we express that in our art, cave or otherwise. And then I combined it with another question, which was about class structure. And the question also said, were Tamil builders, and Tamils are our boats, were Tamil builders some of the richest of the tribe? They had heard another presenter say that. And was there a tiered system of wealth? And the idea was that based on that other presentation, they got the idea that there's a kind of a mixture of socialism and capitalism. And they wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that subject. So great questions. And so I tied these two in together, even though they are separate questions, they're kind of interrelated. Both of these questions are quite deep. And unfortunately, when we have these short presentations and these short time frames, we can only kind of touch the surface, but I'm gonna kind of try to do the best that I can in a short time. So I kind of feel that this is partly why there's so much misinformation, because the anthropologists that wrote all this information way back when they're writing, it's not that they're not correct in the information they're writing, but what sometimes is not correct is their interpretation of what they are receiving. So that's where I want to kind of add the clarity. And also that when we do these presentations, we can only cover a little bit, so it doesn't go as deep as if you were part of the tribe and you were receiving this your entire life. So the truth is that there were social classes, definitely. And they're basically hierarchies, but they're to a certain degree. our captains, and there were at least 3 different kinds of captains. Our ceremonial leaders and medicine people, our star readers and seers. And this is kind of like in the order, but it's not like a stringent order. Our bead makers that made our money, that's a very hard job. And they were so tiny and precise. So they were very well respected. Our tomo makers, very well respected. But we also had our elders, our thinkers, our teachers, our storytellers. And I was thinking about this, what I should have added also on that line was our singers and our dancers, because that was also ceremony. So those are up there on that line. And then our hunters, because we did have some that were extremely good, and our basket makers, our crafters, our artists. And then came like basically the common folks, the family unit, the practical workers. But the reason why I say it's a loose hierarchy is because our spirituality all ties into this. It's like we're all come to this world to do something, and we all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses. But every single tribal member is valued, cared for, and takes part in our sacred practices. So, like I said, even though there is a hierarchy, it's true, but they're not like beneath. Everybody is like in the circle, and we have our leaders that have to lead us and set the rules and stuff like that. And then we have our people who have strong craftsmanship. But then our people down here, we couldn't survive without those workers, those people who are bringing in, gathering and bringing in the foods for us. So this is continuing to that question about spirituality, sacred beliefs and practices, and class structure. So it was touched upon about our art. And most of you are probably very well aware that we did pictographs and even petroglyphs. But these pictographs are very, like, people don't really understand them. You look at it and you can only guess about what you're seeing there. And there was only very little that was written about them. We see the pictures, but it's all up for interpretation, right? But what we do know is that it wasn't just like graffiti. Like this was something that a seer or a ceremonial leader dreamt about or was given from spirit. And this had to do with, sometimes you'll see a picture of dancers. These are our Antap people. These are up on the hierarchy because they're the ones that are, they're kind of like the ones that are leading the ceremonies. And then we also had sand paintings, which were part of our ceremonies. So each time we had a ceremony in this particular type of ceremony that needed to be held, we had these artists that would do it along with the ceremonial leaders because the subject had to be dictated. And then we needed the artists to help to make it. Again, I said I would touch about hunting. So the hunters, we had ceremony before the hunt where we prayed about it and we danced and we sang. And when that animal's life was taken, we believed that that animal was giving himself to us so that we could survive. And we would never like mount the head on a wall or do anything like that because we thought that was disrespectful. So when that animal was there laying and breathing his last breath, we would give it water and breathe into its nose to give him its last breath of life so that it could go on to the afterlife in the way that he should, in a respectful way. And the other thing that we know, and this was especially documented on the Tongva, but we know that the hunters did not eat their own catch. Why would that be? Because then you get that hoarding or, you know, we want to make sure that everybody has enough food. So the food and even what was gathered would go into catches. And the captain or the tumier or the wot, these are chief names, they would be the one to distribute. And also we wanted to make sure that we had enough food when we would have gatherings, when other people would come to our village, we would needed to have food to give to the people. So that would come from that store. Captains also solved all disputes. And if it was a very serious offense, then it was handled by the council. So the chief and the elder council would come together and they would decide how the person who broke a law would have to pay restitution. But we didn't have prisons, so everything was resolved. You paid your restitution, you learned your lesson, and then we move on. And like I said, the Tongva and the Chumash, even though linguistically we are not attached, totally different languages, but we intermarried. So it was very common for us to speak both languages. And we had the same kind of religion. We had the same boat and seafaring technologies. So we were so interconnected that if something was documented for the Tongva, it was probably very similar for the Chumash and vice versa. Okay, the next question was, what is the general feeling for current day Chumash towards Father Sarah? And I'm sure you all have heard a lot about it, the tumbling of their statues. So this one, there's mixed opinions. Some of our Chumash and Tongva are devout Catholics and Christians. And we know that the next question asks about the mission. So that was kind of forced upon us. But right now, they're devout. And so they may not hold the same feelings that other people do. But from my experience, the majority of people, they want them to come down. The majority of people feel that memorializing anyone who contributed to physical, mental abuse, genocide, all the atrocities that happened during that mission system, it's a constant reminder of the things that happened. And so they just think that should come down. We should not be memorializing these people. So the next question asked about the Spanish and missionaries, the treatment of the people, the conversion into religion, the land ownership. And he said, I'm assuming he, I don't know, wanted to know this heavy, horrible stuff that happened. And it's true. A lot of things were very horrible during that time. So I suggest 3 books that are really deep into the subject. There's A Cross of Thorns by Elias Castillo. There's Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda. There's Pagans in the Promised Land by Stephen Newcomb. And his book is quite costly. So the other thing you can do, and oftentimes for free, is catch his lecture on the Doctrine of Discovery. It's very good. And they go into in-depth. And we know that it's not opinion because they take the writings from the priests who actually wrote and documented all this stuff. So it's pretty deep. But what I want to do right at this point is share my personal family story with you. So my 6-time great-grandfather was taken at 7 years old from our village, and he was taken to San Gabriel Mission, where he was baptized with the Spanish name of Prospero Dominguez. We will never know his native name, because from that moment on is how he will be known. We will never know what happened to his parents, because they were not brought into the mission system. I don't know why, because I happen to know that his father lived into an old age. But for some reason, they did not get pulled into the mission system. My personal belief is that because San Gabriel was kind of far from Comicrangna, our village, as that they were pulling in people from the surrounding area of where the mission was. And because of disease, our people were dying at such a strong, fast rate that they would pull in from a little bit further and pull in from a little bit further. So by the time they got up into the Santa Monica mountain range, I believe they had enough adults, but they wanted the children because they were basically trying to eliminate us. And what you do is you take your children and you teach them their ways, their language. You forbid them to dance, to sing, to speak in their language. You forbid them to have their own, participate in their own ceremonies, their way of life, hunting, eating, everything that was known to them would be wiped away from their memory. So the other thing the missions did is when they brought these people into the missions, they separated the families. And how better to break that tie than to split them apart. The men went into one dorm, the women and the children would go into another dorm. And as the boys got to a certain age, they would have to go in with the men. They were overcrowded dorms. It was dirty. They were sleeping literally like person to person across the floor in a room. They were not fed well. They were given food that was unfamiliar to them and sometimes kind of just, if not rancid, not very tasty because they were making large vats of this food. And it basically was not healthy enough to keep them, it was not nutritious enough, I should say, to keep them healthy for the work that they were doing. Because we were the people building the missions. We were the people tending the plants and food for them, learning how to sow plants because we didn't ever plant them. So this was a trade that we were learning. Prospero happened to be trained to be a vaquero, or, you know, what's the word? Like a rancher, a ranch hand. So that was what he was trained to do. So the offenses that I see that the Spanish missionaries did was first to our land. And remember, our land is our relative. So they manipulated the land. They did not respect it. They controlled the water. The water also is a relative. And then planting their own plants that came from a different region, a different country, a different continent. By putting those plants here, our native plants started to die. And when our native plants die, the animals who rely on them start to die. So it changes everything. And also that they had this superiority complex. So the doctrine of discovery basically says, if we're not Christians, we're not human, and therefore you can take our lands. So we weren't Christians, so we weren't humans, and that's how they treated us. They treated us like animals. But isn't that so strange, because animals were our relatives? They should not be treated bad either. The second amount of offenses I see is like the disease that they brought, things that we didn't have the antibodies to fight. So that took out a huge amount of our people. But then there was the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual abuse. And I say of all native life, because I include the water and the lands in that. And then the last group of offenses was that they were supposed to have come in a respectful way with the Bible and follow what the Bible says. And we know the teachings of Jesus was to be loving and kind to all. But instead, they were interested in control versus kindness. They judged us. Everything was greed, because who funded their exhibition over here? So everything was about greed and what could be taken back to the old world. And so I see them as basically ignoring Creator's laws and being selfish and doing what they wanted to do to make them stronger. So I hope that answers your question in depth. The next questions I got was, they wanted to know about the size of the villages there around Satwiwa. And also a second question was, where and when the indigenous people actually lived around the Santa Monicas and how they survived the arid climate. So the landscape has changed drastically from what it used to be back when we lived in our villages there. And the location of some villages is unknown. It's kind of like they put it on a map, but it's kind of based by a description. So this is where we believe the village was. Yet other villages are definite. We know that it was there because I think it was documented so well. Sometimes there was actual historical finds as they were building and digging and for construction. Also, things were very, very well documented for certain villages that were very large and strong. And the last part was that there was J.P. Harrington recorded a whole lot of information from the native people that still had the language and still had their memory. So this was in the late 1800s to early 1900s where J.P. Harrington was speaking to people. So all of that put together kind of lets us know where those villages were if it was unknown. The villages in the Santa Monica Mountain Range varied in size. Some were very small, only about 25 people. As a matter of fact, there's some villages could be only like 16 people, but in the mountain range here, the average size was anywhere from 25 to 225 people. And it's estimated that the Chumash population there was about 1,300 people, and that there was less than 100 Tongva. Now, what is this based on? It's based on baptismal records, because like they took Prospero and they said he was Comikrabit, he was from Comikrangna. So they are counting him as Gabrielino or Tongva. But what I want to make very clear is that our people intermarried. So even though he's considered Tongva, he was half. His mother was Chumash, his father was Tongva. So he's being counted as Tongva in this case, but he's both. So I think that these figures are skewed. It only tells us how many people were baptized and from what village. So that's where you get your head count, right? But I know that there were Tongva people living in Chumash villages, and there were Chumash people living in Tongva villages, and their children would be both. So there's no way that we can put an exact number on it. And then the question about like what time frame. All tribes have their own creation stories. So with the exception of the Athabascan tribes in the Southwest, all the tribes around here say that they've been here from time immemorial. And I believe that needs to be respected, because in the beginning, anthropologists were saying, oh, they were here for 3,000 years. And then it went, oh, maybe 7,000 years. Oh, maybe 12,000 years. And now they're finding things that are 20,000 years. And they're going to keep finding and keep finding. And so I believe that all of these theories are wrong. If the people say that they have creation stories and they came from here, they did not come through that land bridge, and they've been here from time immemorial, then that's what we have to accept and respect. So this is continuing from the question above about the villages in the Santa Monica Mountain Range. So the question about how did we survive in the arid temperature? And I thought that's a great question, because originally it was not arid. When water was natural and flowing free, that's where our villages were, along the water sources. And it was very comfortable for the most part. So think about that. If water is abundant and things are green, and we're up on a mountain range that we can feel the air from the ocean, and there's moisture from the ocean, it actually was a pretty comfortable place to live. It became arid when we started controlling the water sources, damming things up, and basically killing the streams that were so abundant at that time. But another part of it, because yes, there are places in high elevation that get very cold, and there's places down in the deserty areas that get very hot. So the other thing is that we were semi-nomadic. We went from village to village. So even though we're like Prospero, he's Comikrabit from Comikrangna, right? That's what was put down. He must have gone to his mother's village as well in those time frames. So they moved around for several reasons. One, the comfort of living. And number two, so that we didn't put too much tax on the environment around us. If we move out of a village, we let everything come back. So we were semi-nomadic, and we did have multiple villages. So that is known. But some people that have studied this area extensively, amongst others, I'm putting Chester King, because he really has focused a lot of information on this area. And so there's great information to find. So I put the link in there, and Raisa, if you want to share this with people, that's absolutely fine. That link will take you to the PDF, and it's a study of the overview of the Indians that lived in Santa Monica Mountains. And it's very, very informative and very thorough. And there's actually maps that talk about the Tongva and the Chumash, how it was shared territory. And then if you want to know about a specific village, you could actually Google the village. So I did that with Talapop, which is on the, it's up in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's one of the ones east, but it's west of my village. And I found that a report specifically on that village, so you can dive deeper about that specific village. And then I'm going to share some other maps with you as well that will kind of give you an overlay. So it'll show you where the villages were originally and the size of the villages. And then it'll show you today how it looks. And you can kind of imagine where the exact locations are of the villages. So that's this screen. So this image here to the left, you see the words Chumash here, you see Tataviam up here, and you see Tongva here. Can you see the actual pointer? Okay, so down where all of these boxes are, these are villages. So here's mine, here's Komikrabit, which is actually, the people are Komikrabit, the village is Komikrangna. All of the Tongva villages have an NGA. And Topangna, this one here. Now, so I say that this line is incorrect, that it should come down this way and then include Topangna as Tongva. We know that Chumash lived there, but Chumash also lived in my village. Like I said, we intermarried. But with, oops, I'm sorry, I went too fast. Let me go back up. So what we know is if it was considered a Chumash village, it means that there was a Chumash chief. If it was considered a Tongva village, it had a Tongva chief. So it was kind of like who governed that village. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't people of both nationality or both tribes living in there. So I wanted to show you, let me come up to this map here. And here at this little peak right here, oh, I'm sorry, this peak here, and then right down here, this little valley, I think you will know that that is basically where Satwiwa is. So right here, Satwiwa. If you come down here, you see Point Magoo, which over here is our Muwu. If you come over here, you see Malibu, which is our Humaliwu. So here is the peak. Here's the peak. Oh, I'm sorry, my thing is very touchy. And so actually Humaliwu would be more like over here. And then you have Topangna. So that would be over in this area, and then Komikrabit would be over here. So Komikrabit was the furthest east within the Santa Monica mountain range. And because they were governed by the Tongva, we were very attached to Bayona wetlands and going down into Tongva territory, as well as being part of the Chumash. So I'll tell you, for instance, in that PDF that I shared the link to, it actually has my family lineage in there referenced. And it talks about Prospero, and it talks about his father, that he was known as Menan Sumat. So what this report is saying is that even though this is a Tongva village, there was a Chumash person living there, right? But what I know of my family, Menan Sumat was not actually Chumash, he was Tongva. And it was his wife, Kutsil, who was Chumash. She moved into his village. And the reason why is that Tongva people were patrilineal and Chumash people were matrilineal, but because Menan Sumat was given that name by the Chumash because he was in Chumash council. He was considered a thinker. And he was on the, when there would be those disputes and they would need to go to council, he was a council member. So on the actual baptismal record for Prospero, he is listed as Nenan Hunar. Nenan Hunar is a Tongva word. Hunar means bear. So he really had a Tongva name, but Menan Sumat was more of a title, a respectful title that he was given by the Chumash because he was a council member in the Chumash. Now, when we married, you become part of that tribe. whether you are lineally part of that tribe or not, you are accepted by that tribe as long as you're in good standing. And so this map up here, let me get a pointer. This map up here also shows the same thing as the other maps. So here is, oh my God, I'm sorry, my pointer is moving around and I have to move something out of the way. Okay, so here we got the peaks, and I believe this should be Satwiwa here. And then this comes down to Muwu, over here, Humaliwu. So you could kind of see where the villages were. And then the final map I'm gonna put is, you're probably familiar with it. I'm sorry, it's not taking me to the next screen. So let me get out of this and do it forcefully. This map. And this is put out by the Santa Monica Mountains. So same map, but I wanted to include it because this is things that you're probably very familiar with, all the different hiking trails, all the different places. So when you do an overview and you want to see where those villages are, you can go this way as well. So that is the end of my presentation. I would like to say Kakinalin, Aweshkoneha, thank you. So Kakinalin is Chumash for thank you, Aweshkoneha is Tongva for thank you, and of course in English. And I'm gonna stop sharing screen, and I thank you, I really do thank you. These were excellent questions.
Thank you, Tina. Everybody, I'll be sharing Tina's links in a separate email along with the books that she mentioned. Going back to the chat box, there were some questions. This one's so Tina, what was the actual purpose of using Datura?
So Datura is a medicine, but it's not the kind of medicine you take when you're sick. It's when you are going to go, well, first of all, only certain people took it, and that would be our seers and our, what's the other word? The people who read the stars, our Antat people, the people that were ceremonial would take that. And yes, it will take you to a different space here so that you can connect to spirit and so that you could tell the people what we need to be preparing for. But it was also administered, like I said, during that ceremony for the youth. And it, again, was to give them their vision of what they needed to be in their lifetime. So that's what it was used for. But it's such a sacred medicine. Like I said, we didn't do it like, you know, like you would drink a beer or something like that. In Chumash, the word for it actually means moon. So it was called that because the flower also is open at nighttime. So it's the same word for moon. But so I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Also, speaking of the tribal populations, you mentioned, you know, most of it was based on the baptismal records. One of the volunteers wanted to see, do you happen to have an estimate number what you think they might be in actuality during that time?
I would say that I would probably use the figures that are published. So they say that there were about 1,300 people in those villages that have the Chumash names. And there's probably under 100 of the Tongva people based on those villages. But then I would probably say that in each village, and you can't even say each village because it's going to vary, but let's say the 4 closest villages to the Tongva area. Well, let's say it this way. What we do know is that our people married at least 7 villages out in each direction. And so you could say that, oh, so there's Tongva people even 7 villages out into the Chumash territory. So if you took just a percentage, because it would be someone who married into that tribe, and say there was like maybe could be 10 to 20 people in a larger village that were Tongva, but it's a Chumash village. So I hope that gives you like an idea.
Mm-hmm. Can you go into more detail about how the matriarchy was practiced in the Chumash, right? You said they're more matriarchal than the Tongva.
Yes. And basically what all that means is that you're following that lineage to your mother's side. So that's how you would figure, like, Tongva are patrilineal. So I'm going to go to my father's side. And that's why we, like I said, Kutsil, who was Chumash, would have moved to his village, which was Tongva, because he was a man of stature. If it was the vice versa, he was just like a commoner, he might move into a Chumash village because they're matrilineal.
Okay. And then, some fast questions popping up now. So this is a good one, because I know you could speak from experience, you and Jessa and the rest of the family. How are members of the Tongva and Chumash preserving their use of their respective languages?
Oh, thank you for that.
Are there language schools where you could learn, or how is that being brought back?
Okay, thank you for that. That's such an important part, because the language ties us to our history and to our ancestors. So revival is huge right now. Basically, for the Tongva, I am part of the Tongva Language Committee, and we have a teacher. Her name is Pamela Monroe. She's very well known. She was a teacher, linguist, and professor at UCLA, and she has studied the Tongva language for well over 20 years. So she has compiled a dictionary and a lesson guide, and all of it is based on Harrington's notes, C. Hart Merriam's notes, and bits and pieces from other people who also recorded the language. So that's how we're reviving that language. And being that I am a singer-songwriter, I also have been making songs in the language as well, and poems. On the Chumash side, there were very many different dialects. So depending on where you were, in the Santa Monica mountain range, they had their own dialect. It was very similar to what they call Ventureño, which are the people who went to the Ventura Mission. And then going a little bit more south, you have Smuich language that came from Santa Barbara area, and so on and so forth. There's Obispeño, and it goes to each mission area. They had a separate language. So I am learning Smuich, which is the Santa Barbara language. I've been learning for about 7 years. I started with a good friend named Stephen Villa, and then I am now learning under Deborah Sanchez. So these are just people who have studied it along with John Johnson. And the really cool thing with the Chumash is so much has been documented, even orally. We can literally listen to people speaking the language, singing the language, and the stories were documented so well. So we're not privy to the oral on Tongva. It's all written. The only thing we have that's oral, like the J.P. Harrington files, the only thing we have oral is the songs.
Yeah, that's amazing that he was able to record all those. Do you differentiate between Spanish and Mexican occupation? And I hope, Ralph, I'm answering.
Yes, yeah, because it literally is different. When I would say Spanish occupation was when they first landed here from the ships, Boscana and all of them are missionaries. Mexican rule would be once this became Mexico, all these southern states of the United States became Mexico, we would call that Mexican rule. And then of course the American rule. So we kind of say there were 4 genocides: the Spanish, the Mexican, the American, and then we also actually call the gold rush a genocide as well, because so much happened during that time.
Well, that's a great way of putting it. I've semi-thought like that too, but then it's good that you brought in the gold rush. This one is, the Chumash and Tongva Ananism religion did not include belief in a monotheistic supreme being. but did believe in an afterlife. Could you say anything about that as far as the afterlife?
We actually do believe in supreme being. We know that Creator created all, and we pray to that. But yes, there were also other things that played into it. For instance, the stars. You know, we have bits. I forget the word. I'm sorry, but bits of our DNA is the same thing that's connected to the stars. So we believe that we come from the stars, we go back to the stars. We believe that when we die, we go through the west gates. The Chumash are the west gate keepers. So there's a lot of beliefs that have to do with the religion, or if you will, because we don't really call it a religion, more spiritual practice. I think I'm getting off. I've kind of forgot part of what that question was.
No, I think you asked the afterlife part.
Oh, I know, is that we also believe that there were 3 worlds, you know, and that doesn't mean heaven and hell and earth. That's not what our 3 worlds were. They were levels of where we lived, and that middle world is where we live today now. And then when you cross over, you're going to go up to the higher world. But it's not, like I said, like heaven. We don't believe in heaven and hell. All spirits ascend. But the first level of the world was before human. It's when the beings that weren't human lived here. And then you evolve into the second world, and then you evolve to the third world.
That's great. You know, this next question, I've struggled with this working at Satwiwa, especially coming in and working and finding the correct term, because every individual had a different thought or respect, right? And I always try to respect every guest host we have at Satwiwa and make sure I present them in the proper way in their eyes. And so this question is, do you have a preference for either Native American, Indian, or another term?
Yes, you're right. There is a lot of variety. People feel very strongly about them. So I would say that I'm pretty easygoing. I don't get offended, but I like that conversation, because definitely we weren't Indian. We were never from India. And that's kind of a misnomer that stuck on us. So I don't really like that. And yes, this was not called America originally, but I'm okay with Native American. Here's my grandson.
Hi,
Honor. So personally, I prefer Indigenous. Like I said, I won't get upset if anyone says Native American, or I just don't really care for the word Indian.
Yeah, and it does get, you know, mixed. I hear, you know, the government goes by American Indian, and I'm like, well, does that mean they're from India and they're American here, like Mexican American? So I personally have always just said Indigenous, or Indigenous presenters. But again, like you said, everybody has a different take on it. Someone's asking if you are familiar with Dr. Benjamin Madley's book, An American Genocide.
Yes. That is another excellent book that really hits to the core.
Yeah. All right. I think that is it for now. I don't see any questions. Anybody out there have any other questions about today's presentation and didn't use the chat box? You're welcome to unmute and ask Tina. If not, if you have any more questions for the next presentation, you're welcome to email me, Riza_Cruz@nps.gov, and Tina will be able to incorporate those questions in her next presentation in November. So thanks everybody for coming out today and listening, and Tina, we'll see you again next month, and thank you again for today's presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm always learning, and I'm sure everybody learned a wealth of knowledge today from you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I look forward to being with you again next time. Take care.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.